In September, BirdLife International launched the 5th edition of its flagship science publication, State of the World's Birds. This report uses BirdLife's own data alongside the wider scientific literature and the knowledge of our partners from over 115 countries to reveal what birds can tell us about the state of nature, the pressures upon it, and the conservation actions in place and needed. So why birds? Well, birds are excellent biodiversity indicators. They can act as a barometer for overall planetary health. And this is because they are widespread and found across the world in all countries and nearly all habitats. Their distribution, behaviour and ecology are much better known than for any other comparable group of organisms. They're mobile and responsive to environmental change, and their population trends often mirror those of other groups of species. They're generally easy to detect, identify and count, so are easier to monitor than other groups. And they're incredibly popular and engaging, and as a result of that, there's an army of people around the world collecting information on them. And what's more, the health of people and bird populations are linked. A recent study in the UK showed that bird abundance was positively associated with a lower prevalence of things like depression, anxiety and stress, while right across Europe, bird species richness is positively associated with people's assessment of their life satisfaction. So what do birds tell us about the state of nature across our planet? Well, unfortunately, the news is not good. Numerous datasets show that bird populations are in decline right around the world. From Costa Rica to East Africa, India, Japan and Australia, the trends are largely negative. Overall, nearly half of the world's bird species worldwide have declining populations, while only 6% are increasing. And these declines and the associated reductions in distribution mean that 1 in 8 of the world's birds are now threatened with extinction. That's over 1,400 species in total, including 231 categorised by BirdLife as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. And the risk of species extinction is escalating, as shown by the Red List Index. This is a biodiversity indicator that was developed by BirdLife, and it shows the balance between the number of species improving in status owing to successful conservation actions, with some examples in green above the line here, and the number of species deteriorating in status, with some examples shown in red below the line. So as we can see, the overall survival prospects of the world's birds are declining as they move ever closer to extinction. And tragically, 187 species have already been lost in the last 500 years, with some examples shown here. Extinction rates accelerated in the second half of the 19th century, and they continue to remain high. And while historically most extinctions were on islands, really worryingly, there's a growing wave of extinctions over continents, shown here in green, and that's driven by landscape-scale habitat loss. Birds can also show us what factors are driving biodiversity loss across the planet. They tell us that human actions result in the vast majority of pressures, and most species are impacted by multiple threats. You can see the different types of threats and their relative importance here. Agricultural expansion and intensification is the most important threat to the world's birds. It impacts nearly 3/4 of all globally threatened bird species. For example, in Europe, increased mechanisation, use of agrochemicals and the conversion of grassland to cropland has caused declines of about 50% in common farmland birds since 1980. Unsustainable logging and forest management is the second most significant threat. Every year we lose about 7 million hectares of forest, and that impacts about half of all globally threatened bird species. And that includes species like the harpy eagle, the world's most powerful bird of prey. This species requires large, old-growth trees to build its nests in, but unfortunately those are the same trees that are targeted for selective logging. Invasive alien species, which have been introduced accidentally or deliberately by people, can have devastating impacts on native ecosystems, and they affect over 500 globally threatened bird species. And that's particularly the case on oceanic islands, where most species have evolved in the absence of mammalian predators like rats and cats. And such invasives have driven nearly half of all known bird extinctions to date. Unsustainable hunting and trapping threatens over a third of all threatened birds. From poisoning vultures in West Africa to take their body parts for belief-based use, to illegally killing birds for food and sport in Europe and the Middle East, where up to 36 million birds are illegally killed or taken every single year. Climate change is already having devastating impacts on the world's birds, and it's projected to rapidly become even more of a threat. For example, mountain species like the golden bowerbird in Australia's wet tropics are being forced to move to higher elevations, resulting in substantial population declines as the area of suitable climate disappears. And in the United States, up to 97% of all species are projected to be impacted by 2 or more climate-related threats, so things like sea level rise and spring drought, by the end of the century. But despite this litany of threats, birds also point the way to the solutions needed and being put in place across the world. The most important action for the largest proportion of threatened species is to effectively protect, safeguard, and manage the critical sites for their conservation. BirdLife has identified over 13,600 important bird and biodiversity areas, and these are increasingly being used to target the designation of protected areas. For example, last year saw the designation of the North Atlantic Current and Evelinov Sea Basin Marine Protected Area. This covers an area of ocean the size of France that is used by up to 5 million seabirds of 21 species, and it was identified through analysis of seabird tracking data by BirdLife. Management of important sites is often best undertaken by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Indigenous peoples' lands cover over 29% of the total global area of key biodiversity areas identified for birds, of which about half falls outside of protected areas, so they may well be significant for conserving many of the most important areas for biodiversity. Retaining remaining natural habitats within and beyond KBAs is essential, and where habitats have become degraded, restoring them is necessary. And here's a great example of how BirdLife are doing this in Paraguay.
Here at the San Rafael Reserve, one of the most important Atlantic forest remnant in Paraguay for endemic birds such as the helmeted woodpecker, we are protecting and restoring that Atlantic forests by planting native trees and encouraging local producers to grow yerba mate, a native plant that thrives under the forest canopy, supports endangered birds, and provides a sustainable means of income. Thank you.
Beyond protecting, safeguarding, restoring, and effectively managing these key sites, we need to tackle critical threats impacting birds and other biodiversity. For example, by ensuring that all use of species is legal, safe, and sustainable. In Cyprus, BirdLife Cyprus have been taking action that has successfully reduced illegal mist net trapping of migrant songbirds by 84% since 2002. And on islands from the Pacific to the Atlantic, BirdLife partners and others have successfully eradicated a range of invasive alien species, and that's enabling native species like the South Georgia pipit and little penguin to recover. While on the world's oceans, implementation of measures to prevent seabird bycatch have successfully reduced seabird deaths, as we'll hear now from BirdLife in Namibia.
It has been over a decade since the Albatross Task Force began working to reduce seabed bycatch in Namibia, and in response to our advocacy, a regulation was passed requiring the use of mitigation measures, such as the use of bird scaring lines, which has been successful in reducing seabed bycatch by 98%, saving about 22,000 seabirds every year.
Some species require targeted recovery efforts to prevent their extinction, as we'll hear now from BirdLife in Mauritius.
For over 40 years, the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation has led efforts to save the endemic pink pigeon from extinction. Thanks to actions such as captive breeding, supplementary feeding, brood manipulations, and translocation of birds from site to site, including islands, we have been able to take the pink pigeon from a low of 9 birds to over 500 birds currently.
And here's a great example from India, where BirdLife are taking action to save South Asia's vultures.
Here in India, the Bombay Natural Society and its partners have successfully raised over 500 vultures of the 3 critically endangered gyp species in our conservation breeding facility. We house over 800 vultures of the 3 species in 8 different centers in the country. We are now starting to reintroduce these vultures to the wild to boost the depleted populations.
And as well as these sorts of actions, to conserve biodiversity, we must mainstream its values across society, ensuring that nature is fully integrated into policy and planning processes. And here's a great example of such work being undertaken by BirdLife in Asia.
In 2021, we at BirdLife International partnered with the Asian Development Bank and the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership to develop a regional flyway initiative to protect, manage, and restore priority wetlands across 10 Asian countries. Through our partnerships with stakeholders such as national governments, development agencies, and the private sector, we will work to protect biodiversity, maximize social and economic benefits, and invest in nature-positive solutions that would also include local people.
Underpinning all of these efforts is the need to educate people about the natural world, raise awareness of its plight, and build people's capacity to conserve it. And here's a great example from BirdLife in Uzbekistan.
Spring Life project connects children with nature by encouraging them to record their first sightings of migratory bird species. Initially European initiative, this project spread to African and Central Asian countries and reached over 34,000 children in 2021.
So despite the desperate state of the natural world, birds provide reasons for hope. They show that with effective responses such as the ones I've described, species can be saved and nature can recover. Some recent science published by BirdLife revealed that between 21 and 32 bird species would have gone extinct since 1993 without the conservation efforts undertaken for them. So all of the species shown here would no longer exist outside of museums were it not for the dedicated efforts of the BirdLife Partnership and many other organisations and agencies. And that means that the overall extinction rate would have been 2 to 3 times higher. So I hope this brief overview of State of the World's Birds gives you a flavour of what the report contains. It focuses on birds because they are excellent environmental indicators, yielding insights into the wider health of the environment. A key take-home message is that we are losing nature faster than ever owing to escalating pressures, so urgent action is essential. We now have a critical decade to act. Governments must adopt an ambitious and bold global biodiversity framework, a plan for all of society to deliver a mission of being nature positive by 2030, halting and reversing biodiversity loss and setting us on a path for recovery towards the 2050 vision of a world living in harmony with nature. Our future depends on it, and so does that of the world's birds. Finally, I'd like to thank our many supporters, but in particular the Arga V. Jensen Charity Foundation, who enabled production of the report, and the many people who contributed to it. Thank you very much.